Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion in our series focused on the U.S.-China relationship and its global implications as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. If you have questions for today's guest, please feel free to submit them using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. After the live event, you can also listen to these programs on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for being part of the conversation. My guest today, Mr. Nicolas Michelon, Managing Partner at Alagan Partners, a corporate geo-economics consultancy in Dubai. He advises multinational companies, institutional investors, and family offices on geopolitical and geoeconomic risk, supply chain resilience, strategic foresight, and technical startup investment. Nicolas has worked for 15 years in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan as an economist with the French Ministry of Finance, regularly featured in business media. He is an adjunct professor and guest lecturer at ESCP Business School in Paris, the Polytechnique Mohammed VI Polytechnique in Rabat, and Galatasaray University in Istanbul. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Nicolas. So nice to have you with us again.
Thank you for having me back, Sarwar.
Listen, what is Saudi Arabia up to? Trump hotel investments on one side and the nuclear bomb-powered mutual defense pact with Pakistan on the other. Can you put this together for us?
Sure. I mean, it's quite interesting to see what the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been doing over the past few years when it comes to trying to strike a balance in the Saudi relations with the U.S. on one side and with China on the other. We have to go back to one of his major plans, which is called Vision 2030, which is a plan for modernization, but more importantly, diversification of the Saudi economy. Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been very adamant that as much as he doesn't totally buy into the peak oil theme, the end of oil theme, he's already preparing the kingdom for energy transition, new mobilities, agri-tech, med-tech, edu-technology, etc. For that to happen and to be a reality, he understands, and he understood pretty early on, that the technological partnership with the U.S. is not enough, that the technological partnership with the EU is virtually non-existent, and that he needs to build a very deep and tight partnership with China, which is the other hegemonic power apart from the U.S. So that explains a lot of his decisions, strategic decisions over the past few years. He's making it very clear that he has no intention of closing the door on the historical relationship with the U.S., but at the same time, pretty much in the same vein as what India has been expert at since the independence, building up what we call strategic ambiguity, which means keeping intact the capacity of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to build relationships with absolutely any nation they choose to build it with, whenever it makes sense for them. And for the technological partnership, obviously, China is the prime choice.
Now, Nicolas, did the bombing of Qatar, which came out of the blue for everybody here in America, drew a minimal response from the U.S., do you think that had something to do with this? And the second part of this question is, how did the media in the Middle East play this bombing?
I think the bombing of Qatar by Israel which largely failed, by the way. Some of the targets that they wanted to eliminate were not eliminated. We hear that apparently the intelligence services of Turkey might have been involved in warning the negotiators from Hamas that they should be leaving quickly the position that they were at. The bombing of Doha by Israel certainly confirms to Saudi Arabia, but not only Saudi Arabia, confirms to the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, all the states in the Gulf that are members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, confirms to them that the time of the US security architecture is over for them, that the United States of America is not a reliable security partner anymore. A lot of people have been arguing this for years, but this is, I think, the last straw. It makes it impossible to deny that the entire security architecture for the region needs to be rebuilt. Now, it doesn't mean that they are willing, even less able, to replace the US with another nation, say China or Russia or anyone else. It doesn't mean that. But it means exactly what you illustrated with this security agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. It means diversifying the partnerships. In the same vein as they are diversifying the economic and the technological partnerships, Saudi Arabia now is showing that they're willing to diversify their security partnerships as well. Let me give you like two sentences which are interesting because they were pronounced way before those events, but I think they already back then captured the mindset. In 2022, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, said, "We do not believe in polarization or in choosing between sides." He said that in 2022, a few months after the start of the war in Ukraine. And a couple of years before that, the Minister of Foreign Affairs back then of Saudi Arabia, Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud, said, talking about Beijing, not necessarily a better friend, but a less complicated friend than the US. And that was said way before. That was said way before October 7. That was said way before the latest Trump tour in the Gulf and way before the bombing in Doha. So it shows that for many years already in that region, and especially in Saudi Arabia, you had that realization that taking sides is bad for us. Where has it taken us? I'm going to give you an anecdote, but sometimes anecdotes say a lot. It was about 4 years ago, speaking in a conference in Dubai. It was a conference about food technology. I was talking about the impact of the geopolitics on food tech. And I was sitting in one of the, listening to another panel, sitting next to a Saudi gentleman, businessman. We get to talking, where are you from? I'm from France, I'm from Saudi, blah, blah, blah. I asked him, what do you think about Vision 2030? So he was extremely enthusiastic, telling me about the changes that Prince Mohammed bin Salman was bringing to his country. Right. And then he asked me back, he said, "You're French, you're in Dubai now. Be honest, when I ask you what comes to mind when I say I'm from Saudi Arabia, please tell me right away." And he told me, please don't lie. I had those very few seconds of hesitation to be polite, to look for like a polite answer. And he said, "You're thinking about September 11, right?" I said, yes. And he said, "This is what we want to put an end to. Where has the exclusive US partnership taken us?" And this is a Saudi talking. I'm not saying this is my vision, but this was the vision of a Saudi businessman. Where has this security architecture led by the US taken us to September 11? We don't want this. We want people to associate Saudi Arabia with technological progress. We want them to associate Saudi Arabia with NEOM, the linear city, even if they don't build, even if they don't go all the way to 150 kilometers or whatever they had planned to. But he says we want to fundamentally change the entire image, so that when people think about Saudi, they think about tomatoes growing in a desert, desalination plants where we are able to explore the technology, hydrogen trains We want people to think about this. And what he meant by this was to do that, to achieve that, we need partnership with China for the technology.
Well, Nicholas, that's a fascinating anecdote. But it raises another question in my mind, which is, at least in the United States, people are saying that there is so much business being done by the Trump family in the Middle East that this is a real payout for being very close to Mr. Trump. My question is, the Middle East countries are not really democracies in the sense of France or England or so on. Do you think that they're used to this, that the people are used to everyone around the ruler making money, whereas for us in America, this is something quite new? You have any thoughts on
that? I would say that it's not so different in our countries. It's just we are much more hypocritical about it. We don't want to admit it. When we learn that the entire entourage of the Biden family did this in Ukraine and did that in the Gulf, it shocks people. When we hear that the entire entourage of the Trump family does this in the Gulf or this elsewhere, it shocks people. It doesn't shock the people in the Middle East because they're used to it. I'm arguing that we are not so different, except that they are making it known in the Gulf. They're totally making it known. Now, when we come back to the investments by members of the family of Donald Trump in the Gulf, a lot of those investments were made pretty obvious during his tour in May of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. But when you look at the numbers that were announced, very much Trump in a Trump fashion, very big numbers, some of them making no sense. If I remember correctly, the UAE pledged to invest in the U.S. over the next 20 years an amount that is superior to the GDP of the UAE. Okay, it makes absolutely no sense. Qatar promised to buy, I think, more than 200 planes. I mean, how many new connections will they have to start to justify those numbers? So a lot of those numbers are made for the media, to make first page on the media. And a lot of them are pledges, promises of investments. So let's have another episode of Polaris-Live together in 20 years, and we'll see if those investments actually happened. This is, being a European based in the GCC, this is the way Trump does things. Big numbers, flashy numbers, and then people forget the story altogether. How many people are actually going to check if those investments are actually happening in the next 20 years in the US?
Yeah, if you allow me, that reminds me of all the pledges of huge increases in defense spending from European countries. I can hardly wait to see how many of them follow through. But that's for another program, Nicholas. We could talk about. But let me take a moment to remind viewers that Polaris-Live is commercial free and entirely viewer supported. You can view us on YouTube, most podcast channels, and an executive summary of each program is available on Substack. We would, however, really appreciate your becoming an annual supporting subscriber through my website, Kashmeri.com, or through Substack. We always welcome your comments on our video and podcast channels. Polaris-Live will, in public interest, remain without cost, but anything you can do to support us, we would appreciate that. So I'd like to switch now, if you don't mind, Nicholas, to more the economic and financial and business side. And I want to start by asking you, you mentioned at one point some months ago, I believe, that the old model of China being factory of the world and America, the largest consumer, is over. Does that still hold? You still believe that?
Absolutely, absolutely, more than ever. I do believe that one of the reasons, there are many, but one of the reasons for Donald Trump trying to restructure the entire trade architecture with these trade wars and etc., is to try and force investments into the US to contribute. I don't believe it's going to go very far, but to try and contribute to some form of reindustrialization of the US. So the US understands, I believe, that it needs to become, again, an industrial powerhouse. China, on the other hand, enjoying that position as factory of the world, the uncontested industrial powerhouse, is making efforts to actually go beyond that. So it's interesting that China is continuing its progression up the value chain, whereas the US, having abandoned to a certain extent, much to the same tune as Europe, abandoned industry, realized that they need to reindustrialize. I think one of the uses for everyone of a terrible event like the war in Ukraine is to remind everybody that as much as we are in the 21st century, as much as our mind is focused on advances in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, drones, etc., you need quantity to win any war, military, economic, financial, or otherwise. You need quantity. The 21st century, postmodern economies are not able to abolish the importance, the absolute importance of quantity. And that means the capacity to build in massive quantity. You mentioned, as almost as a joke, and I totally agree with you that it is a joke, you mentioned this plan by Europe to rearm Europe, 800 billion euros. For example, first and foremost, I was not aware that we had 800 billion euros, but that's good news. Even if we have them, it means we need to reindustrialize massively, because what is at stake is that Europe is able to build massive number of tanks, massive number of drones. It's all very well and nice to use drones in warfare, but it doesn't mean using 1 or 5 high-tech drones. It means using swarms of cheap, inexpensive Iranian-like drones, Turkish-like drones. You need a lot of them. So you need an industrial powerhouse behind you, something that most Western countries have lost. The worst example being the UK, thinking that they could switch entirely to services.
Yes. It's in the Middle East, it's very hard in America, Nicholas, to buy just about any household convenience that isn't made in China. Is it the same in the Middle East?
It's not as bad in the Middle East, I have to say. It's not as bad because the Middle Eastern economies, especially the Gulf economies, are surprisingly diversified when it comes to their trade partners. They are surprisingly diversified. A lot of the materials are coming from China, but a lot of them are coming from India as well. A lot of them, increasingly large part of those materials, those inputs, come from the rest of the Middle East region. Because we have to remember, especially the Gulf states, one of the ways that they can project power is by increasing trade relationships with the rest of the region. And then you have to start talking about Africa. You must be extremely impressed by the progress that the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis have made in terms of economic influence in sub-Saharan Africa, alongside the Turks, for example, at the expense of European and American influence, and sometimes at the expense of Chinese influence as well. So they go and source over there, but they also go and finance projects over there. And that's the best diplomacy you can make these days. A very positive diplomacy.
Now, Nicholas, you have a very valuable economics background. Do you see any evidence that trading currency is starting to switch in favor of the yuan?
You're talking about the Gulf states?
The Gulf states?
In the Gulf states?
Yes.
Okay, in the Gulf states, what we see, and the numbers are pretty clear about this, is again diversification. I do not believe that we are anywhere near any major economy being able to replace the US with the Chinese yuan. That being said, the proportion of Chinese yuan being used for trade by those countries is increasing fast. But it's not exclusive to the Chinese yuan. You have more and more trade deals being made, for example, in Indian rupees. The UAE sells oil to India and is getting paid in Indian rupees, which is all very nice because the UAE also buys from India. So those countries have understood that currency diversification is absolutely paramount today. And I think we've discussed this in previous episodes. One of the objectives of BRICS Plus and the enlarged version of BRICS includes the UAE in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia has not ratified its participation yet because they don't want to anger the US too early, but I do believe that they will end up ratifying its participation in BRICS. The final objective of BRICS is to de-dollarize the world economy. But to de-dollarize doesn't mean to yuanize, to make the Chinese yuan the new US dollar, which would be a major mistake on the part of China. China's best strategy to weaken US power in the world is not to propose itself as the new US. Otherwise, people would say, okay, I'm switching between the plague to the cholera. Those are still our two very serious disease that I can die from. So China is being very smart. They're not saying we want to replace the US with the Chinese yuan. They say we want to encourage countries to trade in other currencies than the US. Yuan can be one of the options, but there are many other options.
But also, isn't it, Nicholas, that the world currency, to play being a world currency, requires laws, requires a lot of bureaucracy. It is not easy, right? And so some countries may really not want to do that.
Absolutely. It goes beyond legislation. It means that your central banks need to build serious reserves in other currencies. It means that your commercial banks need to relearn currency risk management. It means that all of the companies, I was talking to in a conference in Dubai last week to corporate treasurers, and I was telling them the impact of geopolitics on the treasury management strategies. And I was really encouraging them to relearn that art of foreign currency management. Wow. But you need to relearn this. So it's going to take some time. It can be painful in some ways. But again, I think this is the strength of those new players like BRICS in that respect, because they don't coerce their members into, let's say, adopting the Chinese yuan massively. They say the Chinese yuan can be an option for you. The Indian rupee can be another option for you. The Indonesian currency, the Malaysian currency, those can be other options for you when it makes sense. And I think this is what is smart about the Chinese approach to contributing to weaken US influence in the world.
It's amazing, isn't it? I'm rereading Dr. Kissinger's book on China. And it's just amazing that for 2,000-3,000 years, the Chinese way of doing business and the Chinese way of diplomacy hasn't changed that much. You know, they treat people and they have a certain way of dealing with them. So what you're saying is of huge importance. But let me, I'm going to go back and kind of try and pull things together, some of the things you've said. And here I'd like to quote Pakistan's the representative, he's a senator on the Defense Committee. He said not long ago that the Americans spent $6 trillion on the so-called war on terror. And the Chinese in the last 10 years spent $1 trillion on 3,000 BRI projects all over the world. And he said, so that's the difference. The Americans are security-centric, military-oriented. The Chinese are economic-centric, development-oriented. I'd love your thoughts on that.
I think those are pretty natural momentums that you see in two economies, in two nations that are not at the same stage of building influence. The U.S. has been enjoying a monopoly on global influence since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is historically a totally abnormal situation. China is still in the process of rebuilding its power, of rebuilding the influence it has lost in the 19th century. So, as I said to your previous, as an answer to your previous question, and that tags into this one, China would be totally foolish to go down the same road now. China needs to be seen as a benevolent partner. And to a large extent, in many countries, when you travel around the globe, especially in the so-called global south, this is largely the image that China has. Of course, there are some criticisms. The Belt and Road Initiative has drawn criticisms. Everybody glosses about, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which is a catastrophe financially, but show me other projects led by the World Bank or the IMF that didn't turn out into catastrophes. Catastrophes happens everywhere. It doesn't necessarily summarize the approach of the nation behind it. But what I see in the Gulf, what I see in Latin America, what I can see in Central Asia, for example, is that net, the image of Chinese investment remains extremely positive because precisely at the times when the US was occupying Afghanistan, bombing, after they were bombing Iraq, etc., after they were bombing Libya, after they were starting an embargo in Venezuela, China was building relationships. They were not destroying relationships. They were building relationships. And because China has this very transactional approach to the way it does things, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to point out the contradictions of the Chinese system, of the Chinese narrative. This is the number one thing that you do in economic warfare in general, pointing out the contradictions of the adversary. And God knows that a 3-year-old child today could point out the contradictions of the US, the contradictions of Europe. There's nothing easier than that today. But with China lecturing no one about their political system, about the situation of human rights in their countries, with China sticking to a largely transactional type of relationship, what kind of contradictions are you going to find in China? They don't lecture anyone about anything. They don't tell Zimbabwe, you should become like China. They tell Zimbabwe, do you want my drones? Do you want me to build your bridges? They tell Colombia, do you want me to manage your power plants, your hydroelectric power plants? They don't lecture President Petro in Colombia about the way he goes about leading his country. So it puts China in a very strong position, and it enables China to continue and show that, unlike the US, they're not afraid of multilateralism, where the US tries to impose bilateral relations that they can win every single time because of their size. China can still say, we are part of RCEP. We are not trying to weaken the WTO. So we are not afraid of that game of multilateralism. This way, they get to win a lot of points very easily, extremely easily. Hence, those two sentences that I mentioned about earlier about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and a previous prime minister, previous minister of foreign affairs. China is a less complicated friend.
Isn't that interesting? I think that's a description that I'm going to have to think about, our viewers are going to have to think about. And in the 2 minutes or so that we have left, I would just really, really appreciate it if you can take the EU and just give us a top line feeling for where is it right now? Where is it right now? And go ahead. And I see a couple of questions coming, so just go ahead and answer that, and we might want to continue for a few moments longer.
You're giving me 2 minutes, so I'll give you two feelings about the EU, and you can choose. The people listening can choose either a rabbit in the headlights or a headless duck. I think we can choose between those two. The EU currently doesn't know what to think about China. Again, I'll give you a sentence by Jean-Yves Le Drian, who was a previous Minister of Foreign Affairs of France under Macron, not so long ago, before he became Minister of Defense. Jean-Yves Le Drian said, China is a partner, a competitor, and an adversary. Well, which one is it? A partner, a competitor, or an adversary? Which one? I think this perfectly summarizes the total confusion of EU leaders when it comes to China, which means it makes it, as things stand today, virtually impossible for EU leadership to consider China as a potential solution to the US. The US has abandoned us. I mean, J.D. Vance said it very clearly at the Munich Security Conference, has turned it back on us. I think the act of divorce has been signed. It's pretty clear. I am of those who think that this has been the case for at least 3 or 4 decades, but nobody wanted to see this. But now J.D. Vance, your vice president, actually made it official. The EU doesn't know what to think. The EU doesn't know where to stand. And the problem that we have, I was saying this as a joke earlier, is that the EU now is in the worst position because we don't even have the money to finance the ideas that we don't yet have. Let's say we have the political will. That's a big if we have the political will. Then we need to have the proper ideas. If we have the ideas, then we need the money to finance those, and we don't have that money. The 800 billion plan to rearm Europe, where do we have the money? First of all, I was not aware we had it. So it means more taxes or more public debt, which is already unsustainable. Okay, let's say we secure the money now. We have it by taxing more, which means encouraging those who can to leave because they are going to be fed up with paying so many taxes. And we have more debt, which is unsustainable, which means we lose even more autonomy. Then we need to rebuild industry, which we have destroyed over the past 40 years. And we need to rebuild industry in a way that we can produce massive amounts. But then we need to make sure we still know how to manufacture this. You know, it's like a football team. They've been losing 15 games in a row. Do you bet on the 16th game being a victory? Maybe not. It looks like that team forgot the culture of winning.
Well, Nicolas Michelon, we've alas run out of time. Listening to you is a real education, and we need to do it more often. Thank you so very much for that thought-provoking perspective. I do hope you will come back and see us again, and I wish you all the luck in Doha. So, and I thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, United States and China, and its impact on the globe. Again, Polaris Live is a totally commercial-free channel, and we would appreciate any support that you give us. So until next time, goodbye, and my apologies again for being late today because of technical difficulties.